Hello, I'm Yamachum Thanawala and I'll be delivering a presentation on understanding tissues under the subject Tissue Level of Organization of Human Anatomy and Physiology. Tissues is nothing but the living fabric. If I had to define it, I'd say tissue, meaning woven, are a group of cells that are similar in structure and perform a common or a related function. The study of tissues is also known as histology. Let's understand the syllabus that has to be covered in the following section is the classification of tissues as well as the structure, location and functions of epithelial tissues. Let's try to address the following question. Name the 4 basic types of tissues that make up the human body. Also, state the characteristics of each. Throughout the course of this lecture, you will be able to answer the following question. If I looked at the human body, it is comprised of a collection of different types of tissues. The nervous tissue, which is responsible for internal communication, also has the brain, the spinal cord and the nerves. If I talk about the muscle tissue, it is responsible for contraction to cause movement so that we can move from one place to another. These muscle tissues are used to make the muscles which are attached to the bones, which are called as skeletal muscles. The ones that make up your heart, which are known as the cardiac muscles, are the ones that are lining the walls of hollow organs, for example, smooth muscles that line the gastrointestinal tract. Third category are the epithelial tissue. These are the ones that form boundaries between different environments. They also help to protect, secrete, absorb, and filter a lot of the components of our body. They also line the digestive tract organs and other hollow organs. The epidermal layer of the skin is one of the predominant tissues which are belonging to the epithelial tissue category. Finally, the 4th type of tissues are the connective tissues, which are again responsible for support, protection, binding all the tissues together. The largest connective tissue that we are aware of is the blood. Along with that, we have the bones, the tendons, fat and other soft padding tissue. So if I have to classify according to the structure and function, the 4 types of tissue, epithelial tissue are responsible for covering body surfaces, connective tissue are responsible for protecting the body and to support the various organs, muscular tissue is responsible for generating movements as well as heat, and nervous tissue is responsible for detecting all these changes and generating impulses or action potentials. If I had to look at the human tissue in a microscopic section, there are different microscopic sections as can be observed on the slide over here. This is an example of light microscopy, an image of the epithelial lining. Light microscopy involves the use of acidic or basic stains or dyes. If I had to use an example of electron microscopy, whether it is scanning electron microscopy or transmission electron microscopy, these are nothing but images which are in shades of grey, but they can artificially be colored for contrast. For example, scanning electron microscopy is nothing but the 3-dimensional structure, pictures of unsectioned tissue surfaces. And transmission electron microscopy is tissue sections which have been stained with heavy metal salts. For example, the TEM of posterior midgut epithelial cells. These metals are responsible for deflecting electrons in the beam to different extents and hence provide the contrast. This is just some trivia information. Now let's move on to the prime important type of tissue that we will be covering in the lecture today. Epithelial tissue. An epithelial tissue or epithelium consists of cells that have been arranged in continuous sheets in either single or multiple layers. These are an example of a simple epithelial tissue. These are an example of stratified epithelial tissue. In both cases, you can observe a basal surface and an apical surface. Further, in a simple tissue, you can observe one layer of cells, whereas in stratified, they've been arranged in one top of the other, hence in multiple layers. The next thing to note about epithelial tissue, the cells are closely packed and they're held tightly together with the help of tight junctions. And these junctions are responsible for holding the cells together and at the same time transporting proteins from one cell to another, and the adjacent plasma membranes have very little intercellular space between them because of this closed packaging. Further, epithelial tissues form coverings and linings throughout the body. The biggest example, like I spoke of earlier, is the skin. Last, it is never covered by another tissue. Hence, it has always got a free surface. So let's understand what the basic elements of an epithelial tissue are. The epithelial tissue has basically got 5 distinguishing characteristics. Firstly, it has polarity. Polarity because it has an apical surface which has been exposed to the body, the exterior surface of a body, or else lining of the internal organs, and they have different structures and functions, whereas the lower side is attached or is called the basal surface. The apical surface is smooth and slick. They can have microvilli, which is allowing for an increased surface area. They can have finger-like extensions along the plasma membrane. They are responsible for absorption and secretion of certain substances. They can be very dense, for example, lining the bronchioles, so they can be like a brush border because of the high number of microvilli that are present over there. Also, they can be motile, like cilia, finger-like projections, which are responsible for propelling substances. So that's on the apical surface. Similarly, on the other end, you have the basal lamina or the basal surface, which is just like a thin supporting sheath. These are non-cellular adhesive sheets made up of glycoproteins and collagen fibers, which are acting like a selective filter between the epithelial lining and the underlying or the deep connective tissue. So by simple diffusion, whatever material, whatever nutrients need to be transferred can get diffused through that connective tissue, through the basal lamina into the epithelial cells. Because of this duality, because of an apical and a basal surface, we talk of the epithelial tissues having a polarity. Second topic or second thing that they have is specialized contacts. Like I spoke of earlier, this polarity is maintained because between adjacent cells there is very little space available, and that space has been covered because of tight junctions and desmosomes, which are nothing but types of cellular junctions which allow the cells to remain integrated with each other, at the same time maintaining polarity. Third, they are supported by connective tissues. So one thing to remember here is that they are avascular, that is, they do not have blood vessels, but they get all the nutrition from the blood vessels by simple diffusion because of a reticular laminar layer just beneath the basal lamina. Fourth, they are avascular like I mentioned, but they are also innervated, which means they do have a network, they do have nerve fibers, and the nourishment that they get is because of simple diffusion. And lastly, they have the ability to regenerate. So every time that your cells get slugged off due to normal process like in response to a bacteria, in response to any kind of friction, any kind of damage because of hostile substances like smoke or any other agent that can destroy the initial uppermost layer of the epithelial lining, the cells can get slugged off and new cells can get regenerated and get replaced in that place. So these are the 5 distinguishing characteristics that make up the epithelial tissues. So they have 3 major functions. First, they act as selective barriers, which limit or aid the transfer of substances into as well as out of the body. Second, they act as secretory surfaces, which are responsible for releasing products which have been produced by the cells onto their free surfaces. And third, they are acting as protective surfaces so that they can resist the abrasive influences of the environment. For example, any toxic chemical, any bacteria, any shock. So the 3 major functions, to reiterate, they act like a barrier, they're responsible for secreting, and they are also a protective surface or lining. Now let's move on to the classification. Before we move on to the classification, let's understand a typical epithelial lining or epithelial surface. As I mentioned earlier, it has the apical or the free surface. It has also got the lateral surfaces which are adjoining to each cell. It has the basal surface which is on the other end of the cells. This entire portion makes up the epithelium, and beneath the basal surface you have the basal lamina and the reticular lamina that ultimately make up the basement membrane. Beneath this basement membrane lies the connective tissue, as well as you can observe that there is an innervation of nerve fibers, which is why we say that the epithelial layer is an innervated layer. So now let's understand a little more about the different individual properties of all these types of cells or all these types of functions. For example, let's talk about the apical surface. This is the one that faces the body surface. It faces the body cavity or the lumen or the interior space of an internal organ or a tubular duct which receives the cell secretions. So this will always be an apical or a free surface. The open side will always be outside. It won't have any covering on the other side. They may contain cilia or microvilli like I spoke of earlier. The second are the lateral surfaces. The lateral surfaces, these are the ones that are facing adjacent cells on either side. They can contain tight junctions, maybe adherent junctions, desmosomes or gap junctions. The third are the basal surface. The basal surface lies right opposite to the apical surface. The basal surface is the deepest layer of the cells and they adhere to the extracellular materials. In this case, you have hemidesmosomes in the basal surfaces of the deepest layer so that they can anchor this epithelium onto the basement membrane. Lastly, what is the basement membrane? As we saw, it is comprising of the basal lamina and the reticular lamina. The basal lamina, basal membrane basically a thin extracellular layer, wherein the basal lamina is closer to and is secreted by the epithelial cells. They contain laminin, which can adhere to integrins in hemidesmosomes. Hemidesmosomes are the junctions, integrins are the proteins. So the laminin protein can adhere or stick to integrin as well as collagen, glycoproteins and proteoglycans. All this is happening at the level of the basal lamina. The second type is the reticular lamina. The reticular lamina is closer to the underlying connective tissue and it contains collagen which is being produced by the connective tissue. Hence, these cells, the connective tissue cells that are producing the collagen are called as fibroblasts. When we talk about connective tissue in detail, we'll cover that portion. So I hope here we understand what the epithelial cells look like, what are their basic surfaces, the apical surface, the lateral surface, the basal surface and the basement membrane, and their basic roles which are to act as a selective barrier, to have a protective barrier and to also be responsible for secretion. Now that we know that it has all these roles in the body, let's take a brief classification of the types of epithelial tissues. The epithelial tissues can be classified into two types. The first ones are called the covering and lining epithelium. They form the outer covering of the skin as well as some internal organs. They also form the inner lining of blood vessels, ducts and body cavities, as well as interior of the respiratory system, the digestive, the urinary and the reproductive systems. So we can see that the epithelial tissue are basically the lining epithelium. The category of the covering and the lining epithelium are responsible for covering the skin. So they're like a protection. They're covering the skin as well as covering the internal organs of not only your blood vessels, your body cavities, the various systems of our body. The second type of epithelia are the glandular epithelia. As the name suggests, they make up the secreting portion of the glands. So they are the ones which will be responsible for those cavities, those areas wherein secretions will occur. For example, the thyroid gland, the adrenal glands and the sweat glands. Now let's look at the covering and lining epithelium in detail. So the covering and lining epithelium has been classified in two types. First, on the base of their arrangement in this arrangement of the cells in layers. So if I have to look at the layers, the initial picture that showed you all, that was about simple epithelium, which is nothing but a straight single layer of cells. The second one are pseudostratified, which look as though they are stratified because they are uneven in their orientation, but pseudo meaning false. They are actually just one layer of cells, but they look like they are multiple layers. So hence they are called as pseudostratified. And the third type of cell layers are the stratified epithelium. Stratified meaning layers. The second type of classification of covering and lining epithelium is on the basis of the cell shapes. So whether they are squamous, that is that they are like floor tiles, square floor tiles, or they are cuboidal, just like cube shaped, or they are columnar, they are like columns, or they are transitional, meaning that they are initially of one shape. They could be flat initially and then progressively over time, either because of the relaxation or contraction of the muscles, they move from flat to cuboidal and vice versa. If I had to combine both the characteristics, that is the cell shapes as well as the layers, whether they are simple, pseudostratified or stratified, and the cell shapes, whether they are squamous, cuboidal, columnar or transitional, the arrangement of cell layers and the cell shapes on their combination, this type of classification is something that needs to be memorized for understanding the types of epithelial tissue. First type is the simple epithelium, whether it is simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar, whether it is ciliated or non-ciliated, pseudostratified columnar, whether it is non-ciliated or ciliated. This comprises of the first 4 types. The second category are the stratified epithelium, meaning the cells will be in layers. Now, that could be stratified squamous epithelium, which would mean that they would be in layers, but they would be squamous, so they would be flat tile-like. Now, they could be further keratinized or non-keratinized. The second type are stratified but cuboidal epithelium. Third type are stratified but columnar epithelium. And the fourth category are the transitional epithelium. So now we'll look at each of these types of epithelial tissues in detail. Move on to the next presentation, the next video, for a detailing of the different types of epithelial tissues. I hope you all have had a clear understanding of what are epithelial tissues, their basic roles and functions, their individual characteristics, and overview of the classification of the first type of epithelial cells, which are the covering and lining epithelia. Thank you.